What hadn't you tried? You're already a huge success.
Climbing Mount Everest in the nude has always been.
You can let him do that?
Stop if he wants to, he can.
I'm bulletproof, but I can't fly yet.
He built his whole career on one joke, that nothing ever rattles him. Decades of playing the unbothered outback larrikin, both on screen and in real life, made that persona feel almost inseparable from the man himself. So when an 86-year-old Paul Hogan is spotted looking hollowed out and shaken outside his own home, something bigger than a punchline is going on. The man who once wrestled a crocodile on screen and shrugged off a 7-year tax war with his own government is now leaning, quietly and without cameras invited, on the one person who knows him better than almost anyone left in his life, his ex-wife. Not for romance. Not for nostalgia. For help with the one thing neither of them can fix alone, their son. To understand why that phone call matters, you have to go back to a movie set in the Australian outback in 1985, because that's where this entire story actually starts. Paul Hogan was 45 years old, already a household name in Australia after building a hit sketch comedy show from nothing, and restless in a way fame at home couldn't satisfy. He wanted to be known outside his own country. So he co-wrote a film about a rugged bushman, poured his own money into it, and cast a 27-year-old Juilliard-trained actress named Linda Kozlowski as the sharp American journalist who falls for him. What almost nobody talks about is the part that was happening off-camera at the exact same time. Hogan was still married. He'd been with his wife Noeline since 1958, through 5 children and one earlier split they'd already patched up once. While the cameras rolled in the bush, something between Hogan and his new co-star stopped feeling like performance fairly early on, and people on set noticed long before either of them said anything about it out loud. Crocodile Dundee hit theaters in 1986 and turned into a genuine phenomenon, pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide and making Hogan an overnight name in America. Back home, though, his marriage was collapsing in full public view. He filed for divorce from Noeline, and the Australian press went after him without mercy, turning it into one of the messiest celebrity splits the country had seen in years. 4 years later, in 1990, once that divorce was finally finalized, Hogan married Kozlowski. To the public, it looked almost like fate, 2 people who fell for each other on screen simply making it official. What that framing conveniently skipped over was the fact that this wasn't 2 single people meeting by chance. It was a new marriage built directly on top of one that had just been dismantled, and foundations built that way tend to carry weight that isn't visible from the outside. The wedding itself, held in May of 1990, drew heavy coverage on both sides of the Pacific, with Australian papers treating it almost as the epilogue to the ugly divorce that had dominated headlines just a few years earlier. Kozlowski didn't marry an ordinary actor. She married a man whose entire professional and financial identity was now permanently tied to one character. For a while she leaned into that completely, returning to the role of Sue Charlton alongside him in Crocodile Dundee 2 and later in Almost an Angel, playing on screen the same role she was now living off screen as well. By the early 90s, the 2 of them had settled into life as one of Hollywood's most photographed couples. But here's the part most retellings skip past entirely. Kozlowski had trained at Juilliard's drama division. She'd performed on Broadway in Death of a Salesman before she ever set foot on the Crocodile Dundee set. She wasn't chasing fame for its own sake, she was chasing serious craft, and craft wasn't really what Hollywood was offering the wife of an international comedy icon. She later said, plainly, that a lot of the scripts sent her way reduced her to being the girlfriend of whoever the studio's leading man happened to be that year. By 2001, after a final Crocodile Dundee sequel set in Los Angeles, she simply stepped away from acting altogether. There was no big farewell announcement. She just stopped. It's tempting to treat that as a clean, simple choice, but it wasn't quite that tidy. In 1998, at 40 years old, Kozlowski gave birth to their son, Chance. She said at the time that she wanted a child before it was too late, and that becoming a mother made her happier than her last several film projects combined. That part of the story was genuinely real, and it's worth pausing on, because it means the early years of motherhood weren't where things started going wrong. What also became real, according to people close to the couple, is that somewhere along the way Kozlowski began to feel boxed into a domestic role she hadn't fully signed up for, watching her own professional identity fade into simply being known as Hogan's wife. Hogan, for his part, wasn't a man built for soft, expressive language. He seemed to believe that providing financially and staying loyal covered the entire job description of being a husband. He wasn't wrong that he did those 2 things consistently for more than 2 decades. He may have underestimated whether that alone was ever going to be enough for a woman who'd stood on a Broadway stage and trained at one of the most demanding drama schools in the country. Two very different definitions of love, sitting in the same house for years, never quite translating into each other. By the early 2010s, the cracks in the marriage had become impossible to paper over, even for two people who'd spent years trying to make very different personalities fit into one shared life. By 2013, something had to give. That October, Kozlowski filed for divorce in a Los Angeles court, citing irreconcilable differences after 23 years of marriage. She was 55. Hogan was 74. Their son Chance was 15 at the time, old enough to feel the shift in the house even if he couldn't fully grasp everything behind it. The divorce was finalized the following year. The settlement told its own quiet story. Hogan kept full rights to the Crocodile Dundee character and the production company tied to the franchise, the one piece of the marriage that had never really belonged to Linda in the first place. She kept custody arrangements for Chance and stayed on in their Venice Beach home for several more years afterward. What stands out most, looking back at how both of them actually talked about the split once the cameras weren't rolling for ratings, is how little drama either of them added to it. Hogan later described the marriage, according to reporting from the Daily Telegraph, as something that simply wore out over a quarter century rather than something that failed. He pointed out that he and Linda were opposites in almost everything, the food they liked, the music they listened to, and that those same differences were what pulled them together at the start and eventually pulled them apart. Kozlowski, speaking to New Idea, put it even more simply, saying the two of them had just naturally grown apart because they didn't actually have much in common once the initial spark faded. Neither one painted the other as a villain, which is honestly rarer than the tabloid headlines from that era made it sound. After the divorce, Kozlowski didn't disappear into quiet retirement the way a lot of people probably assumed she would. She split her time between Los Angeles and Morocco, where she met a tour operator named Moulay Hafid Baba. Together they built a travel business centered on guided tours, and she married him in 2017. She also turned out to be a lot savvier with money than people gave her credit for, putting part of her settlement into Venice Beach real estate during the exact stretch of years when that neighborhood became a magnet for new tech wealth. Hogan, meanwhile, stayed in Los Angeles, kept the Venice Beach house, and kept Chance close. While Linda was quietly building an entirely new chapter of her life, Hogan spent years tangled up in something far less glamorous. Starting in the early 2000s, the Australian Taxation Office opened an investigation into Hogan and his financial advisors over allegations tied to offshore accounts, a case that became publicly known as Operation Wickenby. It dragged on for years and, according to Wikipedia's summary of the public record, at one point involved Hogan being barred from leaving Australia under a departure prohibition order while the alleged tax liability was still being disputed. Hogan later compared the experience to dealing with the tax office as though they were an occupying force, and the charges were eventually dropped, with a confidential settlement reached years later. Even once it was legally over, the years of scrutiny left a mark on his public reputation that never fully faded. There's an interesting detail buried in that tax saga that rarely gets mentioned alongside the headlines. According to Wikipedia's account of the case, Hogan was publicly named in 2007 as part of a group connected to a roughly $300 million Australian tax fraud investigation, and the matter dragged through mediation, government pressure, and international banking disputes for the better part of a decade before it was quietly resolved. Even years after Hogan insisted publicly that he'd come out on top, the Commissioner of Taxation later suggested that Hogan had ultimately paid tens of millions of dollars to settle the matter, without either side ever admitting fault. It's a strange footnote to a career built on playing the most laid-back man in the world, a decade of his life spent fighting his own government while simultaneously trying to hold together a marriage that was already fraying at the edges from a completely different direction. By his 80s, the physical toll on Hogan became impossible for cameras to miss. He was diagnosed with a condition called retroperitoneal fibrosis, a benign growth of scar tissue that had wrapped around his abdominal aorta and pressed on one of his kidneys. In interviews with Australian outlets including Sunrise and A Current Affair, Hogan explained that the corticosteroid treatment used to shrink the growth ended up being almost as brutal as the illness itself, stripping away his muscle and body fat so severely that he said he could eat anything he wanted, fried food, fatty food, whatever he liked, and still not gain a pound. His joke that friends of his on strict diets resent him for it, since he gets to eat whatever he wants without consequence. He also ended up needing a pacemaker fitted. In his own words, he described feeling feeble in a way he never expected at this stage of life, and admitted that his grip had gotten so weak that he now needs his son to open jars for him. He said that staying strong and active all the way up until he turned 79 had been a genuine blessing, and that turning 80 was when things really started to unravel physically. In 2025, photos surfaced of Hogan being wheeled through Sydney Airport, and the internet immediately jumped to conclusions about a medical emergency. He addressed it directly in an interview with 7 News, explaining that it was arthritis combined with a knee injury from skateboarding, a hobby he apparently still hadn't given up well into his 80s. He laughed the moment off publicly the way he always has. In that same conversation, though, he made a much more reflective comment about his own mortality, saying he'd like to return home to Australia to spend his final years, and ultimately his final moments, back in the country where his whole story began. People close to him have since told Australian outlets that keeping up that trademark laugh has gotten noticeably harder over the last couple of years. One insider described watching him go from someone who was constantly out and about to someone who spends far more time at home than he used to, and attributed the shift less to age itself and more to the accumulated stress of everything happening around him. Friends have reportedly said that his once obvious spark has dimmed, and that the change has been gradual enough that it took a while for people outside his closest circle to notice just how much it had crept up on him. That same year, 2025, also gave audiences something warmer to hold on to. As part of a full 4K restoration of the original Crocodile Dundee, a companion documentary called Love of an Icon, the legend of Crocodile Dundee brought Hogan and Kozlowski back together on camera for the first time in years, sitting down separately to reflect on the film that had shaped both of their lives. For fans, it played like a gift, a chance to see the original Mick and Sue looking back on where it all started. By most accounts, it was a genuinely warm moment for two people who'd spent over a decade living on opposite sides of an ocean and a finalized divorce. But that reunion was never about rekindling anything romantic, and neither of them has ever pretended otherwise. It was about two people making peace with a chapter of their lives that had already closed, while still clearly caring about how the other one was doing. Which brings us to the part of this story that nobody saw coming when that divorce settlement was signed back in 2014. Chance, now in his late 20s and fronting a punk band in Los Angeles, has spent recent years struggling publicly with his mental health, and those struggles have occasionally spilled out onto social media in ways that alarmed fans and reportedly devastated his father. In one video posted to social media, he appeared visibly distressed and made comments suggesting he wanted his own life to end, a moment that multiple outlets, including the New York Post, reported on at the time. He later walked the comments back, saying he'd actually been exaggerating. Hogan, frustrated by how tabloids covered his son's struggles, has at times pushed back hard against the coverage, at one point telling an interviewer that Chance gets unfairly painted in the press partly because he knows the cameras are watching and plays up to them, even as people close to the family have made clear that Hogan doesn't actually believe that about his own son. Reports from earlier in 2025 had already painted a picture of a young man drifting further out of reach. Chance had reportedly been sharing erratic posts on social media, some of which showed him with unexplained injuries, and family sources told outlets like New Idea that Hogan was at something of a crossroads, torn between his own wish to move back to Australia and his son's refusal to leave the only country he'd ever really known. One insider described the situation as a kind of limbo that was exhausting for everyone close to the family to watch unfold from the sidelines, with no clean solution in sight for either father or son. That tension boiled over into something far more serious in May of 2026. According to reporting from Fox News, the New York Post, and multiple other outlets, police were called to Hogan's Venice Beach home around 10:30 in the morning over a reported domestic disturbance. Chance had already left the property before officers arrived, but he was tracked down later that day and arrested on a domestic battery charge, with bail set at $20,000. Photos obtained by reporters showed Hogan himself outside the home speaking with officers alongside an unidentified woman who was seen providing information to police. The Los Angeles Police Department later said it couldn't release further details, citing confidentiality rules that apply specifically to domestic battery cases. It's still not publicly confirmed exactly who was involved in the altercation or what set it off. For Hogan, this wasn't something he could laugh off the way he handled the wheelchair photos a year earlier. According to sources who spoke to Woman's Day, he was left visibly shaken by the arrest, described by one insider as simply exhausted, a man in his mid-80s who shouldn't have to be managing a crisis like this on top of everything his own body had already put him through. Reports also indicated that Chance has struggled for years with difficulties that predate the arrest by a long stretch, including troubling behavior at home that had quietly worried people close to the family well before police ever got involved. And this is where his ex-wife stepped back into the picture. According to multiple accounts from Australian outlets covering the family in the weeks that followed, Kozlowski became directly involved in helping manage the fallout, staying in close contact with both Hogan and Chance, making regular trips to Los Angeles to check in on her son in person, and reportedly urging Hogan to look after his own health as the stress of the situation visibly wore him down. Sources described the two of them as determined to work through the crisis together, even as they acknowledged it was shaping up to be a long and difficult stretch for the whole family. Whatever emotional distance had settled in after the divorce seemed to fall away almost immediately once their son needed both of his parents in the same conversation again. What makes this particular chapter so different from every earlier scare involving Chance is the sense, reported by people close to the family, that this time genuinely feels different to both parents. Insiders have described Kozlowski offering to take Chance for a stretch so her ex-husband could rest, only for Chance himself to resist the idea outright, unwilling to leave the friends, the music scene, and the only home base he's ever really known in Los Angeles. Hogan, for his part, has reportedly told people close to him that he isn't going anywhere until his son is genuinely on steadier ground, even as his own health continues to decline in ways that worry the people around him. It's put both parents in an uncomfortable position, united in their concern, but still navigating very different instincts about what their son actually needs, and neither one willing to force the issue in a way that might push him further away. People understandably want a story like this to end with some kind of romantic reunion, especially after the warmth of that 2025 documentary Reunion. But that's not really what's happening here, and Hogan himself has never suggested otherwise. What's actually pulling these two back into regular contact isn't nostalgia for 1986, and it isn't unfinished romantic business. It's two aging parents, on opposite sides of the world, both quietly frightened for their only child together, choosing to set aside more than a decade of distance because nothing else mattered as much in that moment. Kozlowski built an entirely new life for herself in Morocco. Hogan stayed behind in the same Venice beach house he once shared with her, holding on to the one relationship from that marriage that never actually ended, the one with their son. 23 years of marriage didn't survive. But whatever bond let two people build a life together in the first place apparently didn't disappear either. It just changed shape, waiting quietly in the background until it was needed again. Maybe that's the more honest lesson buried in this whole story, that the end of a marriage doesn't have to mean the end of everything two people once built together, and that sometimes the truest measure of a relationship isn't how it ended, but who still shows up years later when it actually